Kurt Von Diest for RGG-EDU, and today we're going to retouch a Vietnamese salad from the restaurant Death in the Afternoon. So we have 4 captures we're going to be working with to create this final image. Rob has identified capture 434, this image, as our overall hero, mainly for the background. So we really like the quality of the bokeh and how all of the bottles look in the background. But it's not right for our salad itself. For that, we have 3 other exposures that we're going to combine into a focus stack. So in order to have this really nice shallow depth of field, to get this really nice bokeh, Rob wasn't able to get the entire salad in focus in one capture, which often happens. And so he's racked his focus and taken multiple exposures with slightly different points of focus. So we're going to combine these into a focus stack, taking the sharpest parts of each, and hopefully, fingers crossed, it's going to come together really well. But sometimes with these auto features, you just never know what you're going to get until you try. So to start with, we're going to process out our hero image, our base image, and I'm going to just process that separately than the others so I don't get too confused about which is which. And I'm going to go ahead and save this as a PSD. So once I have that PSD saved on there, I know that that is my hero base image that I'm going to work with. And now that I have that in Photoshop, I'm going to go back to Capture One and select my 3 exposures that I'm going to use to create the focus stack, and these are just for the plate of food, just the Vietnamese salad itself. So I'm going to select these 3 and process them and bring them into Photoshop. So I have my 3 images for the focus stack, and I'm just going to combine them into one document with each image as a layer. So I'm going to click and drag holding down the Shift key to, have to have them both kind of zoomed out for that to work. And once I combine one, I'm going to move it out of the way so that I'm not forgetting which one I've already brought in. So I have my 3 images for the focus stack in one document, and then I have my hero image that is ultimately the background. I'm just going to save this for later and just work on this focus stack for the time being. So here I have my 3 images, and although they're lined up based on the outside edge of the file because I brought them into the document holding down the Shift key. So they're lined up by the outside, but you notice that as I turn them on and off, things seem to move around in the picture. And that's because as the focus point is moved, it changes the image, changes the size and alignment of some of the small features. So to overcome that, we're going to auto-align these layers. To do that, I've selected all 3 layers, and I'm going to go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. And we're going to use the auto intent here. And so Photoshop is looking at this and trying to line up, is enlarging or reducing each layer so that each layer's objects line up. Okay, and now if I turn them on and off, you see that just the focus changes and things don't jump around as much. And so now I want to blend them into a stack to just take the sharpest elements of each layer, and Photoshop is going to create a mask for each layer, just masking in the most sharp elements. And we'll find this under Edit, Auto Blend Layers. And here we have a choice. We could also use this to create a panorama, but in this case we're stacking them because they're just different focus points. And it's going to do its thing. So this is a lot for Photoshop to kind of crunch, to look at each element and decide what is the sharpest element. And with anything in Photoshop that's kind of auto-based, that it's using a lot of math algorithms in the background to try to figure out what it should look like, sometimes it works really well. And with each version of Photoshop, they keep making these things better and better. So this is one that works most of the time these days, but there's still some things that it gets hung up on. Particularly if anything moves in the frame, it's going to have a really hard time aligning those up. So here it's given us our result, and so let's take a look and see how well we did. And you see that you get these crazy masks. Photoshop's deciding which pieces are the sharpest, and it does it in a very scientific, mathematical, precise kind of way. These are not the type of masks that you or I would create with our paintbrushes. So we have some sharper information here, and the beef at the back is nice and sharp. But one problem that we have is right here in the middle of our stack, our potato is a little soft. It's sharp here, and the beef is sharp here and here, but this little tip of the potato and this section of these noodles are soft, and then it gets sharp here again. And so we've looked through all the captures, and it's just we missed this one little fine section of focus in the focus stack. I don't have a piece to use that is totally in focus around this potato. So this is where the best made plans sometimes don't work out, right? That we're intended to shoot a focus stack where I could put everything together and have it nice and sharp from the front of the salad to the back of the salad. But stuff happens. Stuff comes up on set and whoops. And so that's where retouching becomes problem solving. It becomes shoot insurance rather than having to recreate all of this set to reshoot this just to get that little potato tip in focus. That's what we'd need to do if we wanted that in focus and we didn't want to do some other whiz-bang Photoshop trickery to help solve this. But since we're learning some retouching skills here and also kind of shoot skills in general, sometimes stuff happens. And it may be because of just an oversight. It may be because somebody in the process changed their mind. Usually that's a client. Or, sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate, something out of the control of the production team. And those are all situations where it comes down to the last step in the process, retouching, to fix anything else that happened on the shoot that just came up. So this is a perfect example of a very minor thing. We just barely missed the focus of the top little nub of this potato. So we're going to look at a couple of things that we can do to correct for this. And this is where I love Photoshop because it's about problem solving, and every problem is different, and there's not a black and white answer of this is the right thing to do or this is the wrong thing to do. But Photoshop is this giant bag of tools, and so it's about finding the right combination of tools to solve the problem at hand. And sometimes you don't know what that is. You just have to start trying wrenches until you find the one that works. So in this case, I could look at doing this a couple different ways. I could maybe use my clone stamp to artificially create a harder edge to this potato. Now that I'm zooming in, I've been calling it a potato, but now actually I think maybe it's a radish. Whatever it is, this little vegetable with the sesame seeds on it. I could maybe clone a hard edge around that and would trick your mind into thinking it's more in focus. But I also have these noodles that are out of focus, and they're in between something that is sharp and something that is sharp. So I know that the camera doesn't work that way. So I want to make this true to how a lens would capture the scene. So that might be one thing I could try. I could also try to just really sharpen this, but I know from experience that this is really out of focus and that there's no amount of sharpening that's going to fix this right here. Okay, so I'm just going to take that off the table. I'm not even going to try it. But these are things that you might think of, and so I wanted to mention them. I think what the answer really is we wanted this to be nice and sharp all the way from front to back, but given this situation, we're probably going to have to live with this area, the front of the salad, going a little soft. So we'll keep our sharp focus here and let this fall off a little out of focus. Not as out of focus as it was in camera, which if I can find that capture, that's what that looks like. It was really out of focus. I don't want to take it that far, but bridge the gap so that this is still out of focus and we don't have things that are tack sharp going to out of focus and then going back to tack sharp. So we had intended to make this tutorial, the tutorials for the food shoot, pretty Photoshop simple. And this is a skill that is a little bit more on the complex side. And I'm going to work through all the steps and I'm going to talk about them, but I'm going to save some of that, some of the nuance of these skills for a future Photoshop tutorial that we're producing. So bear with me as we go through this. Take what works, what resonates with you, play with these things, and if it's confusing, if you don't get each of the things done, know that we're going to come back and learn this skill in very thorough detail in a future tutorial. So in order to solve this, I need to blur this section of the photograph. And like everything in Photoshop, there's so many different ways to blur something. There's so many different ways to make something lighter or darker, right? It's a terribly redundant program, which is awesome. You might know the filter Gaussian blur as the way to make something out of focus. But for a lot of reasons, this is not what we're going to use, and we'll look at some of the subtleties in the future tutorial that I mentioned. Instead, what we really want to use is lens blur. Okay. So these are filters, and filters have to run on one layer of pixels. So our image stack here has 3 layers. So I need to make a new layer that is a combination of all 3 of these layers. So the long way about that is I could select all of these and drag them to the new layer icon to duplicate them. I could also select them and right-click and say duplicate layers. That's the same thing. And then merge them together. Keyboard shortcut is Command-E for merge, or layer menu and merge layers. Not flatten, but merge the selected layers. So this is working with layers and filters. This is something that we'll end up having to do a lot. So it's nice to know the keyboard shortcut for what I just did. Take all the visible layers and merge them onto one new layer. So this is something called Stamp Visible. And it's a long keyboard shortcut, and it's Command, Option, Shift, and E. And we know it's called Stamp Visible because in our history state it says Stamp Visible. That's the only way we see that. So now this is a new merged copy of the 3 layers beneath it. It's identical to the composite of those 3. So this layer's sole purpose is to be there to add our lens blur effect, or any other filter that we needed to run. So I mentioned we're not going to use Gaussian blur, and instead we're going to use lens blur. And the reason why is lens blur, the quality of the blur that it gives, is more true to how a lens makes things out of focus. Gaussian blur is much more computer average blur. It's not like a lens at all. Gaussian blur is still very useful for certain things, but not for making a picture look like it's blurred by a lens. It's just a different look. And how a lens makes something out of focus is different than how lens blur does, but lens blur gets us a lot closer. So lens blur, there's a lot of options here. And this is a heavy filter. So this is showing us a preview, and the preview is not 100% accurate to what the filter will actually be. Okay. So radius is really the control that we want to use, and this is how blurry is it. So that's the choice that we get to make here, is how blurry is it. And I'm really just looking at this section here. To decide kind of how blurry I want it to be. And I can turn on and off this preview. It lags just a second. Like I said, this is kind of a heavy filter. So 43 I think is too much. I'm going to go somewhere like 25 maybe. And so I think this is nice. It looks blurred, the difference between here to here is not so extreme as it was before, but we still see all the differences in the salad clearly. It's not completely blown out of focus like it was in our most out of focus part of our layer stack. So I could say, okay, now, and this filter will run on this layer. So I have my lens blur layer. And it's nice to name this lens blur. Forgot what I wound up with 25. So it's nice to name this with lens blur and then the amount that you did so that I remember in case I need to go back and redo it. And now I'll add a mask. I held down my Option key before I added that mask, so it went ahead and added a black mask. And now I'm just going to mask in this blur. So I mentioned there's a lot more to learn about lens blur, and there is. Lens blur is a really awesome filter in Photoshop. And one of the things that it does that I don't think we need to do here, I think we're getting away with it just fine without using it, is a depth map. What lens blur allows us to do is actually gradually make something less and less blurry as it goes across a gradient. Just like we are with the layer mask. But here it's just deciding where it's blurry and where it's not blurry. With lens blur, with a depth map and lens blur, we can actually make it step down the amount of blur. So that's a really important skill to learn, but we don't need to do it here. So we are going to save that for our future in-depth tutorial. So there, just with a little bit of blur, I think we've solved our problem with this image. And we still see all the detail in here, and I think that this is a nice place to work forward from. So now I have my two documents. One is my layer stack document, and the other is my hero document where we really like the background that's happening here. Really, more of the real estate that we're going to use is from the focus stack. So we could look at it as this is our hero and this is our background piece. It's probably actually the best way to look at it. So I'm going to take our hero background now and bring that into our focus stack document and put it on top. Now, rather than using auto-aligned layers, let's look at doing it the manual way this time. So I need to align this layer so that it lines up with our focus stack food. And so I'm just going to reduce the layer opacity here to 50%. It's good to remember the keyboard shortcuts for changing layer opacity. If you have a tool that it does not itself have an opacity, like the Move tool, then it's just a keyboard shortcut. 20 gives you 20%, 0 gives you 100%, 5 it gives you 50. You just type the number on your keypad. If you have a brush tool or any tool that has an opacity there, that keyboard shortcut works for your tool's opacity. Good to know. Okay, so here is our hero background, and I have it the opacity down some, and so I can see how it lines up. And now I'm just going to free transform, Command T, and resize this to get and rearrange it just to get my plate edges lined up. About there, will do nicely. So one thing you'll find when you get into this focus stacking environment is you're ultimately going to need to crop the image some. The different levels of focusing change how much detail you see at the edge of the frame. So we're always going to need to crop in a little bit for a focus stack. So knowing that as you shoot something that you're planning for a focus stack, don't shoot it to the exact composition that you want. Give yourself just a little bit of extra room so that you can crop into your image just a little bit. So now that it's lined up, I'm going to bring it back up to 100% opacity, and I'm going to hold down my Option key and add a mask, so it adds that black mask that I like. And now I'm just going to paint white to reveal my favored background where it needs to be. So it's really about the bokeh and the light in these bottles. I think these plates on the side, since my new background is cropped in there, I'm going to choose to keep the plates from my focus stack rather than from this background plate. Okay. The other thing about our hero image is we had this fill light on that photographed very green. So I'm deciding now to use this just for the background and not use it for the foreground, because our focus stack doesn't have that green glow, and the shadows are on this front edge of the plate are much more subdued and even. So I don't have as much cloning and cleanup that I need to do to this front edge. Always best to, if you have a capture that solves the problem with composite, to do it that way rather than recreate the wheel by cloning or doing some other work. Turning this off and on, just making sure that I got all the pieces that I wanted to use from the frame that Rob identified as the hero. I could maybe look at just allowing this back edge of the plate to drop out of focus a little bit more. Maybe that tomato we can, or I think that's a radish again. Just to soften that back edge a little bit. No, I think I like that better, um, as it was in the focus stack. So it's tempting to think when you come into Photoshop that you know exactly what you're going to do. It's tempting for me to think that. I've been retouching for a long time. I should be able to look at this picture and know exactly what I'm going to do. But that's never the case. It's always a bit of trial and error. It's always do this and back off that a little bit. Working in Photoshop is about revision. And that's what's so powerful about Photoshop is that we have all these amazing tools that allow us to control every little finite detail, but also keep everything in layers so that we can always come back and redecide where we want this layer to show through, where we want that point on the curves to be, etc. So I'm never afraid to change my mind because that's just part of it. So I see here looking, so I'm going to go into cleanup now, go into my cleanup mode, get my clone stamp, and I'm just looking around the image to see what issues I need to solve. Particularly being mindful of the area that was focus stacked because if anything moves, you get, sometimes the focus stacking doesn't work perfectly and you get little ghosted edges. I think this ghosted edge is from my background layer that I put in, not the focus stack. Oh, sure enough it was. So whenever you have a layer like that and you're not sure, you can turn on and off layers until you find the layer that is the culprit. I know this one is from our focus stack. And so our focus stack, I want to leave those layers alone for the most part. This is an easy thing just to fix with cloning. So I have my cleanup layer. And I'm going to buzz around the whole image, cleaning up anything that is a problem, a byproduct of our focus stacking or our composite with the good bokeh background. But maybe also at the same time just cleaning up anything that catches my eye. So in these background areas, I mentioned, when you focus stack, you pretty much always need to crop in a little bit. But if I can fix it with cloning, then that's nice because it gives us a little bit more image to work with. But along this top edge, there's a lot going on in here. I could clone that up and fairly easily, but you could, that's a judgment call one way or the other if you want to fix some of this with cloning or if you want to fix it by cropping. I always prefer to not crop if I can help it at all. Because cropping, once you throw away those pixels, if you decide you want them back, you're in a whole world of hurt. Just another set of challenges to overcome, and if you didn't crop in the first place, you wouldn't have to overcome them. You can always crop later. Photographers really like to crop because you want that perfect composed image, and if you didn't quite get it in camera, a crop will help you get there. But I've learned over the years retouching that cropping is bad as a retoucher because as soon as I crop an image, I know that's just asking my client or the photographer or someone involved in the process to come back and want it not cropped that way. So I've learned to just never crop, and if at all possible, when I need to crop, if cloning out is an option, something that I can do, that it's nice if I just go ahead and do that. Because then I don't have to worry about it on down the road. You may be looking at this thinking, Kurt is crazy, just crop the image already. And partway through this image, I'm going to start thinking the same thing. But I'm going to plug away at cloning this, and then we'll get that solved, and then we'll move on to some of the other issues. Okay, so I went through the process of cloning out the edge of this document. The top edge, I am going to crop there. There's too many little shapes of bokeh to worry about trying to clone that in, and it's not much of the image at all anyway. So that I'm going to allow to go to the crop. On the right side of the image, there's just like 1 pixel line of transparency, so I'm going to crop that off. And I can always, with the crop tool, if I uncheck delete crop pixels, if that's checked on, those pixels are going to be gone, thrown away. If that's unchecked, they're just hidden under the pixels are still there, they're just not visible. If I took all of these layers and moved them down, I'd have a few more pixels up there that I now just cropped off. Okay, so I'm just going to make another cleanup layer. To get into some of the cleanup on my salad itself and the table surface. These little black holes in the table, they're nice, but they really catch my eye. So I'm going to take them out, or maybe just reduce them. I think once I reduce them, they look like little bruises or blemishes. So I think I'm just going to take those out completely. I think they're more a distraction than textural quality. So I'm going to take those out. Just being very careful to that all of these noodles line up and that I don't see any other gaps where they don't line up between the focus stack. So I'm just taking the time to look at each one individually. It's kind of a maze of different noodles here. But they all look good now. So this little highlight, it's right on the edge of where I did that blur. And it's not quite right. And rather than go back and really refine that blur, I'm just going to take out that little highlight so my eye doesn't catch there. That's kind of a covering my tracks move there. I keep looking at this sliver of radish or whatever it is in this salad. It's kind of transparent. And I keep thinking that that is somehow some part of the focus stack, the blending between the layers being off there. It's not. It's really in the salad that way. But I'm just going to smooth this transition line in between the two. And I think that'll help it look more natural to me. Again, I know what's going on here. I know that I had this issue with the focus stacking that I had to solve by blurring. So I know that's going on. Hopefully when the end person looks at this picture in Rob's portfolio or wherever on the restaurant's website or wherever this picture is going to wind up, they're not going to be thinking about that at all. They'll just accept it all as this was one picture taken. As ultimately, that is always my goal, at least in the vast majority of pictures that I work on, certainly all the pictures like this, I want the retouching to be something that is completely transparent, that the end use of the picture, nobody looks at that and says, oh wow, that's retouched really nicely. I want people to look at it and say, wow, that's a really nice shot. I would eat that. End of day. End of story. But of course, there's some projects that are really composite heavy or have a lot of other needs, or the style that you're going for is very retouching heavy. And in those cases, that it may not be true that people look at it and not see the retouching. You might think it's hard to, that it's easier to do less retouching, but that's not necessarily true. I find that to do good retouching, to retouch something, to solve a lot of problems, but ultimately have it look like it's not been retouched, is harder. Sometimes it's harder to retouch with a very light touch than it is to go in and go crazy on it and add in all sorts of style effects. It's harder to find that small move that just perfects the image enough but doesn't steal the show. All right, so I have my focus stacking, my lens blur, my hero background with a nice bokeh all composited in, and my cleanup pretty well done. A couple other things maybe I want to clean up here. There's just a little bit of this shadow line left. This ball casting a shadow here. I think I'm just going to smooth that out a little bit. So I can do this with the clone stamp. I could also do this with a paintbrush. I like to use the clone stamp first. It's not giving me what I need. I might move to a really low opacity paintbrush and sample a color to paint with. The clone stamp's working well for me in this case. And I just noticed a few spots of odd color on the edge of this plate. I don't know if that's a little light spillover or if that's a little bit of sauce or what's going on there, but no matter why it's there, we'll just clone it out. Oh, and here is a little section of where the focus stack got confused. I have out of focus plate, and then this edge of the plate is really in focus and then out of focus again. So we're just going to make this consistently out of focus, again with cloning. Find that once you get good at the clone stamp tool, it is the end of the road, solve all sorts of stuff tool. That it really is indispensable. And it looks like we have just a little bit of ghosting here along this leaf, also from the focus stacking. So again, I'm just going to average that out by cloning it a little bit. Okay, the front edge of my plate is looking really nice now, consistent color. I don't have those hard shadows from this foreground bowl. I think my salad is all cleaned up. Pretty sure I found all of the instances where the focus stack went a little off. Here along this radish, one more little area. So what I'm seeing in here is this is actually that transition from the lens blur that I added. And I'm seeing little bits of in-focus things that are kind of ghosted over by the blurred. And this is exactly what the depth map in lens blur that I mentioned would solve. In this case, it's only so slight, and I can fix those areas with cloning. So I'm going to do that since I'm trying to save some time on this tutorial and kind of get to some bigger stuff down the road. But still, I see it, I notice it, I need to fix it one way or another. Okay. One other area I want to clean up is just the ends of these utensils. This little highlight here really catches my eye, and I just want to tone those down a little bit. I'm going to make a new layer for this. I like to keep making new layers. Once I work in one area and I feel like I've solved that problem, it's nice just to go ahead and make a new layer to continue cloning on, rather than trying to do it all on one cleanup layer. So there's no point in having this all on one. I can separate it out between multiple. And then if I really make a mess of something, which definitely happens, if I just get carried away and start cloning way too much and I keep cloning over and over and over and it just turns into a smudgy mess, then I can just delete that layer, but not removing the good clone work I did in another area of the image. All right, so I think cleanup is looking nice there. Now I'm going to move on to playing with curves and seeing what kind of contrast I want to bring out. I would like to pop the color in the background particularly a little bit. I see some nice cool tones going back in there, which balance nice with this warm color of the beverage. So I want to bring those out. Adding a little contrast, I think, will really spice this up, boost its saturation a little bit. When you add contrast, you also purify the colors. So you get a little bit more color saturation when you add contrast. So I definitely don't want to ever add saturation before I get the contrast where I want it. So I'm really looking in the background. This definitely blows out the foreground too much. Okay, I get something I'm starting to like. Oops, bump that. Starting to have a little more impact back there. I'm going to flip that to black and see where I was before. And now I'm just going to mask it in. Again, paint white. I have a low opacity brush, 20%, so I might bump that up a little bit, just so over multiple brush strokes I'm building this up. And I can add this level of contrast in other places of the image where I want a little bit more contrast, but the full effect of this layer is too much. Using this our layer mask to make it a localized correction allows me to really put it in here and there a little bit and a lot in another area. Curves definitely blows out these noodles on the top of the beef, so I definitely want to take that all off there so that we carry nice tone there. It's still kind of hung up on this part of the image. My eye goes there and there. So I'm going to look at making a curves that darkens those areas. So the rule of thumb about curves is keep it simple. If you can do it with 1 point, you should. If you need 2 points, that's okay. Should use 3 points only in the cases where you really have to, but never more than that. Never. The other thing to remember about working with curves is you want the curve to be smooth, this curve to be smooth. I'm going to make a new curve just to explain that you can brighten, you can darken, make a simple curves. You can add contrast by making the line more vertical, but you never want roller coasters because it's always, I'm obviously doing this really extreme, but roller coaster rides up and down always do something bad. Even when they're just ever so slightly roller coaster rides, even the slightest roller coaster rides are bad. So as you get used to working with curves, if you're not used to working with curves, keep it simple. 1 point is going to lighten or darken. 2 points is going to add contrast or take it away. And you should only stick to 2 points for starters. Rarely do I use a curve that has 3 points on it. I may have 2 points and then grab the little corner point to bring my highlights down or my shadows up. But that's about it. So looking at this image now, I like how I've toned down that foreground. That feels nice to me. But one thing I'm noticing is over here on the right side, this is the same table surface, but it's a different color. And I think that that is just the way the light is flaring off of it. Or no, maybe that's a, actually now that I say that, maybe that's a napkin. I'm not sure what that is, but if it's just a highlight on the table surface or if that's another napkin, but it seems to my eye to be a different surface. Like I would expect this wood tone to be over here as well. So I'm at least going to take a look at what that looks like if I bring this wood texture over there. Make sure my shadow stays nice and straight. I could also look at putting this on the color blending mode, so I'm just blending in the color and leaving the luminosity the same. And I can look at splitting the difference so that it is a little lighter over there. The more I look at this, the more I think that it is just the corner of a napkin that's stuck in over there. So I want to be sure that I name this layer so I remember which layer it is. Okay. So I like some of the contrast that we have going on. I like that we have a bunch of color in the background now. I'm just going to keep playing with curves to kind of see what I can get. Sometimes I start with this thing. I'm going to add curves to control this particular area to raise the contrast here. And sometimes I just start to play with it. And I think that that's a good is a good thing, you know, that sometimes I'm not sure what I like until I see it. And so just by adding a curves and start, you know, what does it look like with some more contrast and where does that look good? I can kind of discover which direction the image wants me to go in. I think this is moving in the right direction. I'm starting to question this little blob of red, and I think that might be part of this through the different focusing, stacking. I didn't really notice it before, but I notice it now. So I'm going to take it out. And I also noticed some little smudgies in our bokeh, which often happen just from little aberrations in the lens. And I'm just going to smooth those out while I'm fine-tuning my cleanup. Okay, one last thing I want to do to this image, particularly that I like to do in instances where I'm controlling focus. I've softened the focus here, and I'm just trying to steer the eye a little bit more to what is in focus, and that is to add some sharpening. And this is something that we'll look at in multiple tutorials, so I might go a little, I'm not going to look at everything here, I'm just going to kind of do it. Sharpening is something that is a filter, so it needs to run on a layer of pixels. So just like we did for the lens blur, we're going to need to do a stamp visible. So this is really important that I want to do this underneath my adjustments. So for layer organization, I want to keep all my pixel layers at the bottom and adjustment layers at the top. Because these I can always come back and edit, and if I have pixels above them, then they're really locked into to how they are here. So I first want to hide all of these layers to turn them off, my adjustment layers, and have the very top pixel layer selected. And that's where I'm going to do my stamp visible. And if you'll remember, the keyboard shortcut is Command, Option, Shift, and E, which merges everything that's visible onto one layer. Now that that's there, I can turn on my other layers. And we're going to look at Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. Now there's lots of different ways that we can use sharpening. The way I like to use it, the way I intend to use it here, is not to make it look like it's sharper, not to do a fine sharpen, which would be a low radius and a high amount. Instead, I'm going to do a low amount and a higher radius. So radius is how big of a line you're looking for, and amount is how much sharpening. And it does the sharpening by adding highlight to one side and shadow to the other. And I like the look of this kind of sharpen with a lower amount and a higher radius. It kind of just gives some more definition and shape to the areas that are in focus, rather than using this to make something that is not in focus look like it is in focus. Instead, I'm just creating a little bit more dimension to the shape. And I like to name this layer with USM for unsharp mask, and then the values that I chose. Now, always with unsharp mask, I only want it to do this to the areas that really are in focus, because it does change the out of focus areas also. So I'm going to add a black mask and then reveal that over my hero in focus area salad. So just winding down here, this little guy really catches my eye, so I'm going to take him out. And look at my image and see, well, with our focus stack, we can't, it's a little harder to see before and after, but I can turn off everything since we did the focus stack and see what that looks like. See all the changes we made, and I think that this has been a big improvement, and we've learned a bunch of new skills. And with that, I'm going to save this image and move on to the next image.